All right, so are you ready to get to the bottom of Trump's recent comments about Canada's healthcare system? We've got you covered. We are diving deep on this CTV News article that's causing quite a stir and pairing it with some, shall we say, spirited discussions
Hmm.
from Reddit's Der Canada community.
It's certainly an interesting juxtaposition, to say the least.
Interesting might be an understatement. This CTV News piece reports that Donald Trump has gone on record saying Canadians would have much better health care coverage if Canada was to become, wait for it, the 51st state.
It's a bold proposition, to be sure. And it gets even more intriguing when you factor in his rationale. He seems to believe that Canadians would actually see a tremendous tax cut and this improved healthcare by joining the U.S.
Yeah.
It's a surprising stance, especially considering the often discussed state of the U.S. healthcare system.
Okay, I'll admit, the idea of a tremendous tax cut does have a certain appeal. But hold on, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yep.
We've also got those Redditors to consider, and let me tell you, they did not hold back.
Yeah. The reactions run the gamut from genuine concern and skepticism to, of course, a healthy dose of humor. What's fascinating is how this one comment from Trump has ignited a debate that goes beyond just healthcare. It's tapping into anxieties about national identity, economic implications, and even the very nature of the relationship between Canada and the U.S.
That's a really good point. It's like this whole thing has become a Rorschach test, with everyone projecting their own fears and hopes onto it. But before we get too deep into the psychology of international relations, let's unpack some of the specifics. There's this comment from a user named Radiant Pumpkin that I think highlights a key point of contention. They argue that Americans actually pay more in taxes for healthcare than Canadians.
And that's where comparing healthcare systems across borders gets tricky. It's not just about taxes, it's about the overall cost, access, and ultimately the outcomes. For example, while Americans might pay more in taxes, they also often face high out-of-pocket costs for medical procedures and prescriptions. In Canada, those costs are often absorbed by the public healthcare system.
This difference in philosophy really hit home when I read a comment from One Happy Owl 44. They mentioned having a medical condition that requires medication costing a staggering $30,000 per month in the U.S. But in Canada, it's fully covered. That's a life-altering difference right there.
It really underscores a fundamental divide in how the two countries approach healthcare. In Canada, it's viewed as a fundamental right, a social good that should be accessible to all citizens, regardless of their income. In the U.S., it's often treated as a commodity subject to market forces and individual purchasing power.
So while that tremendous tax cut might sound tempting on the surface, it's essential to consider the potential trade-offs. Would Canadians be willing to sacrifice the security and affordability of their healthcare system for the promise of lower taxes? And what about the broader implications for Canadian identity and sovereignty?
Those are precisely the questions we need to grapple with. And I think we can glean some insights from Trump's past behavior. The CTV News article mentioned his attempts to buy Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Wait, what? He actually tried to buy Greenland?
Yes, he did. And while those attempts ultimately failed, they reveal a pattern of behavior that's relevant to this situation.
How so?
Well, they demonstrate Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy. He tends to view international relations through an economic lens, often seeking to leverage American wealth and power to achieve his goals. And this might explain why he frames the 51st state idea in terms of financial benefits for Canadians.
It's like he's approaching this as a business deal rather than a complex geopolitical issue with deep historical and cultural implications.
Exactly. And that brings us to a crucial question.
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences of this approach, not just for Canada, but for the entire North American landscape?
That's a pretty big question. Where do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, we need to consider the potential impact on trade relations, diplomatic ties, and even the social fabric of both nations. And I think we need to look beyond the headlines and delve into what Canadians themselves are saying about this whole situation.
Because their voices are ultimately the most important ones in this whole debate.
Absolutely. So in part two, we're going to shift our focus and explore the range of perspectives coming from Canada itself. We'll dive into opinion pieces, political statements, and even some reactions from Canadian comedians. Because let's face it, if anyone can find the humor in this situation, it's Canadians.
That's a good point. So until then, keep those brains churning. We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive. Okay, so we just spent some time unpacking Trump's perspective in those lively Reddit reactions. But now I'm curious how Canadians are actually feeling about this whole 51st state idea.
That's a crucial part of this deep dive, right? I mean, their perspective is central to this entire conversation. Thankfully, we've got some excellent sources to help us understand the Canadian point of view. We've gathered opinion pieces from some of Canada's leading newspapers, official statements from Canadian politicians, and of course, we've sprinkled in some social media commentary from everyday Canadians.
Sounds like a pretty comprehensive snapshot of Canadian sentiment. What are you seeing in these sources? Any common themes or trends emerging?
Well, one thing that jumps out immediately is the fierce pride Canadians have in their healthcare system. It's seen as a cornerstone of their national identity, and there's a strong resistance to trading it for the U.S. model, despite what Trump might suggest.
That tracks with what we saw in that Canada discussion, right?
Yeah.
All those comments about astronomical U.S. medical bills and the fear of financial ruin over a health crisis.
Exactly, and those fears are echoed in the opinion pieces we've got here. Many commentators argue that while Canada's healthcare system might have its flaws, it's still far more equitable and accessible than what's available in the U.S.
But this goes beyond just healthcare, doesn't it? This whole 51st state thing raises those deeper questions about national identity and sovereignty that we touched on earlier.
Absolutely. And that's where the conversation gets really interesting. Some Canadians view Trump's comments as a genuine threat, an attempt to undermine their independence and absorb them into the U.S.
Yeah, some of those Redditors were throwing around terms like annexation and imperialism. It definitely felt like there were some underlying anxieties bubbling to the surface.
And those anxieties are rooted in history. The U.S. has a long history of expansionism, and Canada has always been wary of being overshadowed by its powerful neighbor to the south.
But interestingly, not all Canadians are buying into the doom and gloom narrative. Some are taking a more lighthearted approach, using humor to deflect attention and even poke fun at Trump's outlandish pronouncements.
Humor can be a powerful coping mechanism, right? And Canadian comedians are definitely having a field day with this turning Trump's words into fodder for their stand-up routines and late-night talk shows.
It's like they're saying, look, if we can't beat him, we might as well laugh at him.
Exactly. It's a way of reclaiming a sense of agency in a situation that might otherwise feel overwhelming. But let's not forget about the official response. What's the Canadian government saying about all of this?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear how they're navigating this situation.
Well, unsurprisingly, Canadian politicians have been quick to dismiss Trump's suggestions. They've been reiterating their commitment to Canada's sovereignty and their belief in the strength of their own healthcare system. They're not mincing words.
But are they taking the bait and getting into a public spat with Trump?
It seems like they're being more strategic. They understand that Trump thrives on confrontation and controversy. So instead of engaging in a war of words, they're taking a more measured approach, emphasizing diplomacy and highlighting the strong ties between the two countries.
Makes sense. They're playing the long game, hoping this whole thing will just blow over.
That could very well be their strategy. After all, Trump is known for his short attention span. But even if he drops the 51st state talk, this episode has exposed some underlying tensions that might not be so easy to ignore.
It's like his seemingly off-the-cuff comments about healthcare have inadvertently cracked open a Pandora's box of complex geopolitical issues.
And those issues have real-world consequences. The CTV News article actually mentioned that some Canadian businesses are already feeling the pressure from Trump's trade policies. There are concerns about job losses and economic instability.
So while some Canadians might be cracking jokes on Reddit, others are facing legitimate anxieties about their livelihoods and their futures.
That's the thing about these seemingly abstract political debates. They can have a very real and tangible impact on people's lives. And it's important to remember that behind the headlines and the political posturing, there are individuals and communities who are grappling with the fallout.
And those individuals and communities have diverse perspectives.
Uh,
Remember that Redditor who brought up the issue of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples? They argued that before even entertaining the idea of joining the U.S., Canada needs to address its own internal challenges and injustices.
That's a critical perspective that often gets overshadowed in discussions about national identity and international relations. It's a reminder that these issues are multifaceted, and that any conversation about Canada's future needs to include the voices and experiences of all Canadians.
So what's next in this deep dive? Where do we go from here?
Well, we've explored Trump's perspective, we've heard from the Reddit community, and we've delved into the Canadian response. Now I think it's time to zoom out and consider the broader historical context.
What do you mean?
Well, the relationship between the US and Canada has always been a complex one. There have been periods of close cooperation and friendship, but also moments of tension and rivalry. And I think understanding this historical backdrop is essential to making sense of the current situation.
That makes sense. It's like
Mhm.
we need to put this whole 51st state debate into perspective.
Exactly. So in part three, we're going to take a step back and examine the long and winding history of US Canada relations. We'll explore how these two countries have navigated their shared border, their economic ties, and their cultural differences over the centuries.
I'm already intrigued. It's like we're about to embark on a whole new deep dive within a deep dive.
That's a great way to put it. So buckle up and get ready for part three. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of this fascinating and ever-evolving relationship.
Okay, so we've heard from Trump, we've seen what the Redditors are saying, and we've even explored all those different perspectives within Canada itself.
Yeah, and I think now's a good time to zoom out a bit, look at this whole situation through a wider lens. You know what I mean?
I'm with you. So where do we even start with this whole U.S.-Canada history? It feels like a pretty massive topic.
Well, we could start with like the very beginning, the foundations of both nations. The US obviously born out of revolution, rejecting British rule, and Canada kind of evolved differently, as a dominion within that British Commonwealth.
So right from the start, they had these totally different origins, different paths to becoming countries.
Exactly. And those differences, those really shaped their interactions early on. Like the American Revolution led to all those loyalists fleeing north to Canada, which solidified their connection to Britain and, kind of created this cultural divide with the US.
So basically, there was this like underlying tension between them right from the get-go.
Yeah, you could say that. And sometimes that tension boiled over into actual conflict. The War of 1812, for instance. The U.S. tried to invade Canada, but they didn't succeed.
Wow. Seriously, I never learned about that.
Yeah?
I guess they don't really highlight those moments in the U.S. history books.
Ah,
Yeah. Well, but what's interesting is that even with those early conflicts, the U.S. and Canada eventually built a pretty peaceful and cooperative relationship. I mean, they share the longest undefended border in the world.
that's wild, especially when you think about how many countries are constantly fighting over their borders.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that peaceful border, it's really helped them build a close economic partnership. The U.S. and Canada are each other's biggest trading partners.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars in goods and services flowing back and forth every year.
So it seems like they've managed to build this strong and beneficial relationship, even with all their differences.
Yeah, for sure. But it hasn't always been easy.
Mm-hmm.
There have been trade disagreements, arguments over environmental policies,
Yeah.
and sometimes those nationalistic feelings flare up on both sides.
So this whole thing with Trump and the 51st state idea,
Yeah.
it's just the latest chapter in this long and complicated story.
Exactly. And it's a story that's still being written. You know how these two countries deal with the challenges of the 21st century, like climate change and globalization, that'll determine the future of their relationship? Yeah. It makes you wonder what will happen next, right? What does the future hold for the U.S. and Canada?
That's the big question. But I think by understanding the history, by acknowledging all the complexities of their past, we can start to understand the delicate balance that defines this relationship.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after hearing all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the relationship between the US and Canada is really complex and always evolving. It's shaped by history, by economics, by culture, by individual personalities. And while they might disagree, sometimes there's also a lot of shared values and common goals.
It's like a reminder that international relations, they're never simple.
Mhm.
You need to be nuanced, understanding, and willing to see things from different perspectives.
Exactly. And as we move forward in this world that's so interconnected, that ability to bridge divides and find common ground is going to be more important than ever.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. We've gone from Trump's comments to Reddit reactions to the Canadian perspective and even the historical background of U.S.-Canada relations.
It's been a wild ride. Hopefully our listeners are leaving with a better understanding of this fascinating relationship.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep those minds open, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep.